So we're going to start off. So once again, thank you all for attending this lecture. Thank you all for attending the series of lectures. I hope you found it useful. And today is the last lecture of the series, and we're going to cover spinal fractures and spinal cord injuries. Just a brief history. So spinal cord injuries have been known since time immemorial. It was considered an ailment not to be treated in the ancient times. And we know correctly from Lord Nelson's last word at the battle of at battle, that when he was hit by a cannonball, so he says, all power of motion and feeling below my chest have gone. I can live but a short time. So spinal cord injuries were considered a death knell. Uh, but then there are a couple of events that changed the outcome after spinal cord injury. One was the use of antibiotics in urinary tract infection. So one of the main issues or main causes of morbidity and mortality in paraplegics is urinary tract infection, septicemia, and death. And in quadriplegics, it used to be chest infection, septicemia, and death. So the use of antibiotics in urinary tract infections significantly changed the outcome of spinal cord injury. And the second issue was the issue of pressure sores or bed sores. So there was this German surgeon, Dr. Ludwig Guttmann, who introduced this concept of patient rolling or regular change of position to prevent any pressure sores, and that reduced the incidence of pressure sores to a large extent. So earlier people with paraplegia and quadriplegia, even now, tend to develop pressure sores, and then they become infected, and then the patient becomes septicemic, and then some of them die. So the prevention of pressure sores was a great made a great change in the outcome after spinal cord injury. So most spinal cord injuries occur at the thoracolumbar junction. So between the thoracic and the lumbar spine. So that junction between T12 and L2 vertebrae. 65% of the injuries occur at that level. And that is because it's a stress riser zone, because there is an immobile thoracic spine and a relatively flexible lumbar spine. And the junction between these two is a stress riser. So forces are concentrated here, and that's why this region is most commonly injured. There is also a change in the contour of the spine from a kyphotic thoracic spine to a lordotic cervical spine, and the junction between the two is a stress riser again. And there is also an change in the orientation of the facet joints, because the lumbar spine allows more flexion extension movements, whereas the thoracic spine allows more rotational movements. So the junction between the two, orientations also is a stress riser zone, and that's why fractures commonly occur in the thoracolumbar junction. So when you are faced with a patient with the suspected spinal injury, you need to take a quick history either from the patient or from his bystanders or whoever has brought the patient in on what is the mode of the injury and what happened immediately after the injury. Was the patient able to walk, or was he paralyzed straight away? Was he able to move his hands and legs? Was there any loss of consciousness? Was there any bleeding from anywhere? Was there any neck or back pain? Was there any weakness in the limbs? And how was the patient transported to the hospital? In a large number of cases we see, especially in tier 2 cities and in rural areas, that patients are transported to hospitals in auto rickshaws or at the back of cabs, sitting on people's laps. So not the ideal situation. And if the patient has come in for the first time, needs to be resuscitated. So we know the ABC of resuscitation: airway, breathing, circulation. Take care of all that. Make sure that the airway, breathing, and circulation are all stable before examining the patient. And examination requires you to see and examine the patient from head to toe. So the head, the face, the chest, the abdomen, the pelvis, and all 4 limbs. And you need to turn the patient around and look at the back side of the patient also. So be careful while turning the patient if you're suspecting a spinal injury. Look for spinal tenderness at the back and also assess the neurological status. So there is something called the ASIA scoring. That's the American Spinal Injuries Association score. And after the neurological examination, you need to ascertain whether the spinal cord injury is complete or incomplete. And number two is the patient in spinal shock. So this is the ASIA scoring checklist, and at the end of it, you need to give the patient a score. But there are patients in the initial stages of a spinal cord injury who present with spinal shock. So spinal shock is flaccid areflexia. So all the reflexes below the level of the lesion are flaccid. There is an absence of the bulbocavernous reflex. So the bulbocavernous reflex in males uh, is ascertained by inserting a finger in the rectum and then applying pressure on the glans penis. And if you feel a contracture of the anal sphincter, then you can say that the bulbocavernous reflex is present. But in spinal shock, the bulbocavernous reflex is absent, and it can last for 24 to 72 hours. So when a patient is in spinal shock, it is difficult to ascertain whether the patient has got a complete or an incomplete spinal cord injury. That is number one. Number two is a condition called neurogenic shock. So this is not, cardiogenic shock or hypovolemic shock. So typically in shock, you have, if there is hypotension, you have tachycardia. So, but in neurogenic shock, with the hypotension, you have bradycardia. So need to be aware of this condition, because you should make sure that you do not give the patient too much fluids in an attempt to bring the BP up, because this is not hypotensive shock, but neurogenic shock. So once the patient has come out of spinal shock, then you need to really carefully examine the patient for motor and sensory sparing below the level of the injury. And most commonly, we look at the perianal sensations. So if the perianal sensations are present, that means you're dealing with an incomplete spinal cord injury. So the limbs may be grade 0 motor power, but if the perianal sensations are present, that means it's not a complete spinal cord injury. Some fibers are still intact. And on the other hand, if the perianal sensations are absent after the patient has come out of spinal shock, so when the bulbocavernous reflexes come back, so then that means that the patient is out of spinal shock. And at that time, if the perianal sensations are absent, that means the patient is likely to have a complete cord injury. It is very important to differentiate between the two, because the outcomes of complete cord injury are very poor. The chances of recovery are very, very, very small. So chances of recovery are nearly zero. Whereas if the patient has got an incomplete spinal cord injury, then the prognosis is relatively better. So early management, I need to be careful while transferring the patient, make sure that you take care not to further damage the spinal cord, provide adequate hydration to the patient, provide adequate pain relief. There is this issue of steroids. Should you give high dose methylprednisolone or not? I'll come to that later. Patient has to be catheterized. Gastric protection in the form of H2 blockers and sucralfate should be provided, because they tend to develop gastric ulcers very early. And pressure relieving mattresses. So because the patient is in the initial stages, at least, because of the pain and because of the fear of destabilizing the spine, the patient is left lying on his back, on his or her back. They can develop pressure sores early. So use some kind of pressure relieving mattress, at least in the early stages. The role of steroids, it was very popular in the 90s. Before 2000, and that was based on some trials that were done in the United States. But now the role of high-dose methylprednisolone in spinal cord injuries has become quite controversial. So we know for sure that the complications outweigh the benefits. But still there is a small rekindling of interest in steroids. But most centers have stopped using high-dose methylprednisolone in spinal cord injuries. So once you finish the initial management, then you look at the definitive management. So 3 questions that need to be answered. Is surgery needed or not? Number 1. Number 2, if surgery is needed, how soon should surgery be needed? Early surgery or delayed surgery? And number 3, what surgery? Should you go from the back? Should you operate on the spine from the back? Should you operate on the spine from the front? Or should you do both? So the rationale of surgery in fractures is to restore stability, to restore alignment, to provide some neural decompression, and to allow early rehabilitation. So these are the four rationale for surgery in spinal fractures. So like I said, restore stability. So what is instability? So instability is defined as the loss of the spine's ability to maintain its patterns of displacement under physiological load, so that there is no neurological deficit, deformity, or pain. That's the actual definition of instability. But we know that certain types of fractures are unstable, certain types of fractures are stable. And so stable fractures are ones in which on physiological loading, it does not increase the neurological deficit, does not cause any major deformity, it does not increase the pain. So one of the scoring systems we have is called the Steelix classification. And based on the Steelix classification, you can make a decision on whether the patient needs to be operated or can be treated non-surgically. And they look at three factors. Number one is the morphology of the fracture or the type of fracture. Is it a compression fracture? Is it a burst fracture? Is it a fracture dislocation or a translational injury? Or is it a flexion distraction injury? That's number one. Number two is the integrity of the posterior ligamentous complex. So is it intact or injured? So that gives, there are points allotted to each of them. And the neurological status of the patient. Is it intact neurology? Is it only a nerve root injury? Is it a conus medullaris? Is it a chorda equina? Is it a chord complete? Is chord incomplete? So all of them have got points. And based on that, if the patient has a score less than 3, the patient can be treated non-operatively. If the patient has got a score of 5 or greater, the patient would benefit from surgery. If the score is 4, it's an indeterminate gray zone and depends on lots of other factors, including patient factors. Okay, so we come to the classification itself. So there are numerous classifications for fractures in the spine. I'm going to use one of the more easy ones, wherein they're divided into 4: a compression fracture, a burst fracture, a flexion distraction injury, and a fracture dislocation. These are the 4. So this is a compression fracture. So typically, if you look at the vertebrae, they can be divided into 3 portions: the anterior portion, including the anterior half of the vertebral body, the posterior portion of the vertebra, so the anterior portion of the vertebra is called the anterior column. The middle portion of the vertebra is referred to as the middle column. And the posterior aspect here is called the posterior column. So if only the anterior column is fractured like this, it's called a compression fracture. The posterior height of the vertebra is maintained. It's called a compression fracture. This is an example of that. You can see here in this X-ray, you can see the vertebra above and below, nice square-shaped vertebra. But you can see here that there is a compression of the vertebra, whereas the posterior height of the vertebra is maintained. So just look at that. There is a compression there. The posterior height is maintained. And as per that Steelix classification, for morphology, it gets a score of 1. The posterior ligament is intact based on an MRI scan. So it got a score of 0. And the patient had normal neurology. There was no spinal cord injury. So it got a score of 0 for that. The total score was around 1. And this was treated non-surgically. The second one is a burst fracture. So burst fracture, so like I told you, there is an anterior column, there is a middle column, and then there's the posterior column. If the middle column, which is the posterior half of the vertebral body, is fractured, is referred to as a burst fracture. So this is an example. So you can see just look at this vertebra here and this vertebra here. So on the AP view, how do you decide whether it's a burst fracture or not? Because the interpedicular distance is widened. Okay? So if the interpedicular distance is widened like this, it is likely to be a burst fracture. Interpedicular distance cannot widen if the posterior half of the vertebral body is intact. Okay? So And you can see here on the lateral view, there's 2 fractures. You can see the same thing on the MRI here. You can see there is compression on the cord. You can see some hyper-intense signals here on the MRI, signifying that there is an injury to the posterior ligamentous complex also. So this was defined as a 2-level burst fracture, and it was unstable because the posterior ligamentous complex was injured. And on the morphology, it got a score of 2. Posterior ligament complex was suspected to be injured, could be a score of 2 or 3. Neurology was this patient's neurology was normal, got a score of 4, got a score of 0. So the total score was around 4. So it was a, the indeterminate or gray zone. Whereas if the patient's neurology was affected, it would have gotten a higher score and then have surgery. But since it was a 2-level fracture, we decided to go ahead with surgery, fix the spine, did a decompression, and the patient was up and about the next day. So it's a long segment fixation. So this is another burst fracture. So you can see that the interpedicular distance is widened here. You can see that the posterior half of the vertebral body is injured. You can see that. And you can see it very clearly on the MRI. The posterior half of the vertebral body is injured. It's pressing on the spinal cord. And if some of these burst fractures can be treated non-surgically, and if there is a burst fracture associated with an injury to the posterior ligamentous complex or causing any neurology, then it requires surgery. This is a more violent kind of an injury, more severe sort of an injury called a flexion distraction injury, which could go through the ligaments. It could go through the ligaments and disc like this, or it could be all bone through the lamina and through the vertebral body. Some of these are called chance fractures. So this is an example. So you can see it on the X-ray here. You can see the fracture line extending all the way in front. And, all these, just imagine the patient had normal neurology, but the morphology of the fracture, a flexion distraction injury, is regarded as a highly unstable injury. And it invariably occurs along with the damage to the posterior ligamentous complex. So it's got a very high score of 6 to 7, and these patients require surgery. So this is what was done. And fracture dislocations are highly unstable injuries. And this is an example, a dislocation between L2 and L3. You can see that the facets are dislocated here. And on a morphology score, it gets a score of 3. The posterior ligamentous complexes are always torn with another 3. The score is 6, so which is more than a score of 3. So this patient had a surgery, it had a reduction of the dislocation and the fusion. And patient came to us with paraplegia, but at the time of leaving the hospital after rehab, had regained at least his bladder function, so which was a great achievement, and he was able to walk a few steps with calipers. So what are the other surgical considerations? If there is polytrauma, you may have to either delay surgery, make sure that the more serious injuries like the abdomen and chest injuries are taken care of. Hemodynamics is something that you need to be aware of as the patient lost a lot of blood. Prevent hypotension, positioning of the patient sometimes may be difficult if the patient has got multiple other injuries. So these are factors that need to be considered. And as far as surgery is concerned, you can do surgery. So there are 2 parts of the surgery. There's stabilization and then there's decompression. So if the patient is neurologically intact, then you probably don't need to do a decompression surgery. You can just stabilize the vertebra if you think it is unstable. And that stabilization can be done from the back with pedicle screws, can be done from the front using a cage and screws, or it could be done from the front and the back. So this patient has had a cage in front with pedicle screws at the back. So all 3 combinations are possible. So that's stabilization. The next is decompression. So if the patient has had a neurological injury, then and you performing surgery, it is important to take the compression of the spinal cord, and that can be done in numerous ways. One, if you catch them early, they come to you early, just distraction of the vertebra can actually reduce or push these fragments back in. So it's called ligamentotaxis. So using the integrity of the ligaments to push these bony fragments back in. And it's ideally something that can be done within the first 48 to 72 hours. And this ligamentotaxis can reduce the retropulse fragments and take the compression of the spinal cord. If that is not possible, or you're not sure that ligamentotaxis alone will help, then a laminectomy and a formal decompression, either a posterolateral decompression, can be done, or you can do an anterior decompression. So you can go in from the front again. So this is where the whole vertebral body has been taken off, replaced by a cage here. You can see this vertebral body has been taken off here and taken the compression of the spinal cord that is here. So decompression can be done either from the back or from the front, depending on what you're trying to achieve. Important things to remember is if you're dealing with a complete spinal cord injury, the prognosis for recovery is poor. Nevertheless, we still offer them spinal surgery with the aim of getting them out of bed early, so at least onto a wheelchair, just so that they don't lie in bed for longer periods of time, causing, hypostatic pneumonia, pressure sores, urinary tract infections. So getting them out of bed early and getting them into rehabilitation early is one of the aims of surgery. And if the patient has got an incomplete spinal cord injury, then the prognosis for recovery is good. So this is something that needs to be discussed with the patient and their families. And whether you do the surgery from the front or the back, there are lots of different factors involved in the decision making. Number one is the fracture morphology, whether the posterior ligamentous complex is intact, neurological status of the patient, and the patient related factors like obesity and presence of any abdominal injuries may encourage you to not go from the front. And of course, surgeon's preference. So spinal stabilization, like I mentioned earlier, could be done from the back, from the front, or a combined front and back. So this is another, just give you an example. So this is a 19-year-old girl who came to us with following a road traffic accident and polytrauma. So she had a blunt injury abdomen. She also had a fracture of her forearm bones. But in the spine, she had a burst fracture here at L4. She also had a burst fracture there at L1. So we offered her surgery, and this is what we did. The two pictures on the right side are what we did in the first stage. So we stabilized the spine, got the alignment back. We thought that with ligamentotaxis, these fragments of the number 4 of L4 would fall back into place, but it did not fall back into place. So there was significant loss of continuity in the anterior column there. So a couple of months later, we took her back in again. We removed part of that L4 vertebra and stabilized it with a cage like this. So she's back to college, up and about, and she's an architecture student. So she's doing well overall. So these are the options you have surgically, but spinal surgery is only a small part of the treatment of spinal cord injuries. The larger and more important part is rehabilitation. So we're fortunate that we have a very good rehabilitation center with 2 rehab specialist doctors. So the pictures on top are the early management of spinal cord injury, where, if you're dealing with a patient who's got quadriplegia, the problem is their diaphragm may also be paralyzed, in which case they don't have adequate cough reflex. Secretions tend to build up in the chest and they can develop chest infections. So chest physiotherapy, postural drainage, all very important to keep the lungs clear. Prevention of pressure sore, very important. So not to depend entirely on fancy mattresses and alphabets, but regular change of position has been shown to be very effective in the prevention of pressure sore. So secondarily, change of position is what is recommended. And as we go down the line, at some stage, you need to deal with the neurogenic bladder. So maintaining an indwelling Foley's catheter for long periods of time is a sure shot way of developing urinary tract infection, which can ascend up to the kidneys and cause septicemia. So what is recommended and what can reduce the incidence of urinary tract infections in paraplegics especially is intermittent catheterization. So in paraplegics, their hands are good. So you can teach the patients, the males and the females, to catheterize their bladder around 3 or 4 times a day and empty the bladder by themselves. And that reduces the chance of urinary tract infection in comparison to an indwelling Foley's catheter. So that's a very important part. In quadriplegics, it becomes more difficult. So if they have somebody looking after them all the time, then you can do intermittent catheterization. But in quadriplegics, they are not able to do the clean intermittent catheterization by themselves because their hands are affected also. So you need to look at other ways of protecting the bladder. Sexual rehab, very important aspect. So that's why we refer them off to the rehab doctors who take care of all these aspects. So it's not only, so the bottom line, I'm showing you some physiotherapy, getting the patients to walk around with some sort of aids. There are robotic exoskeletons available that can, get these patients to move around a bit, at least inside the house. Getting them back to work. We've actually rehabilitated some of our spinal cord injury patients, especially, if they have some basic knowledge of computers, is quite good and easy to get them back into some kind of IT jobs because they don't have to move around much. So vocational rehabilitation is very important. Getting them back into recreational activities also. You see the Paralympic movement, which has been extremely successful. A lot of them can play sports, can take part in, some sort of athletics. So may not be track, but some field athletics at least. So yeah, so spinal cord injury rehabilitation is a bigger and more important part of spinal cord injury treatment. So surgery forms a very small part of it, but then I spoke more about surgery because that's my area of specialty. But then post-surgery, I refer them within 1 or 2 days, I refer them to my rehabilitation colleagues in the hospital, then who take care of all these, the chest, the pressure sores, the bladder, the bowel. Bowel is another thing that I missed out on, bowel rehab, because their bowels don't work, so they need to be given either laxative, sometimes digital evacuation to keep their bowels moving. And then, of course, physiotherapy, vocational rehab, sexual rehab. So a lot of factors involved in rehabilitation after spinal cord injury. So that is a huge field by itself. So I haven't gotten into that, but most important nevertheless. So with that, we come to the end of today's session. Thank you very much for attending the lectures. You've been a very enthusiastic audience. I've quite enjoyed the interaction and answering questions. I thank Mr. Mallikarjun and his team for organizing this. Be great if you can keep in touch and feel free to discuss difficult cases with me, either directly on my mobile by WhatsApp, or I don't know how long these groups are going to last, groups that we've created. Anyway, Mr. Mallikarjun and his team will be providing certificates to all those of you who have attended. And unfortunately, we've not, I don't think we'll be able to have a sort of a, function to hand over the certificates because we're in the middle of a deadly COVID crisis. So I think, but you will get these certificates at some stage. Thank you. And yeah, just a little reminder, I do run the Scoliosis Foundation of India, which is something which is very dear to my heart. So we provide scoliosis surgery for children who cannot afford it. We give them the same care in the same hospital, on the same beds in Manipal Hospital. So look forward to chatting with you at some stage. And I'm free to take questions just now. So